Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Protection Warrior in Dragonflight. Protection Warriors are extremely tanky. They're the best tank in the game at mitigating damage by far. They can have 100% uptime on shield block pretty easily, so any blockable damage that comes into a Protection Warrior's face is going to be heavily mitigated. On top of shield block, they have a small but powerful collection of offensive and defensive cooldowns, and they have a very powerful set of cooldown reduction talents. So you get access to a lot of cooldowns during combat, but you don't need a ton of keybinds to use them, unlike, say, Brewmaster Monk. For Monk, you need like a dozen different keybinds for your offensive and defensive cooldowns. For Warrior, you only need 6, but you still have cooldowns available extremely often. Shield Wall is a 45-second cooldown on average with the right talent setup. Demoralizing Shout is about a 25-second cooldown on average with the right talents. Avatar is a 40-second cooldown with the right talents. The BFA Protection Warrior playstyle that everyone loved in Mythic Plus is basically back in Dragonflight, but it's even better than before because Protection Warriors have enough damage mitigation in their toolkit to actually be super strong raid tanks now, too. Protection Warrior is the tankiest tank in the game. They're good at staying alive. They don't have great damage output. In fact, they're, I think, the worst single target damage of any tank now that Protection Pally recently had their damage increased. But they're not that far behind the rest of the pack, and they have pretty good burst damage cooldowns. They're reasonably competitive, unlike how they were for long periods of Shadowlands, and, you know, their cooldowns are good. It's a powerful class, but it's also an easy class. You don't have a ton of different buffs to manage at once. You don't have a massive collection of keybinds to go through. You just need to keep up shield block and ignore pain. It's a really good class for literally anyone who wants to tank, but it's especially good if you want to tank really difficult content. Warrior's ability to mitigate so much damage just makes the game a lot easier for them. Warrior's tier set bonuses are super simple but very good, and they synergize well with some talents. The 2-piece bonus grants you 4% damage and damage reduction for 5 seconds after you use Revenge. Revenge is a pretty normal part of the rotation, so this just makes you better at what you already do. It's free real estate. The 4-piece bonus makes the 2-piece bonus grant you 5% of all damage dealt as Ignore Pain as well. This doesn't sound that great on its own. It's basically 5% leech, except it funnels into Ignore Pain. But it also works with the talent Brutal Vitality, which adds 30% of all damage you deal to your active Ignore Pain. You do need to have an active Ignore Pain for that talent to work, so it isn't always functioning. With the 4-piece bonus, it is. This effectively gives you 35% Ignore Pain leech on top of the base 10%, regular health leech that you get from the left half of the talent tree. That's 45% total leech, which is crazy. These are good bonuses. The interaction between the 4-piece and Brutal Vitality is extremely strong, and this is a pretty great tier set for the most part. There is one glaring issue, though, the execute phase. So during the execute phase of any kind of boss, you're going to want to spend any extra rage on execute. That is the point of the skill. But the 2-piece only works with Revenge, and the 4-piece only buffs the 2-piece. It doesn't do anything if you're not using Revenge. This means you can't really use execute effectively and still maintain any value from either of the tier set bonuses. This feels like an oversight on Blizzard's part, and hopefully it's something they can roll into this, but otherwise, either you have to choose between your tier set bonuses doing anything, or using execute during the execute phase. It's not great to have to choose between using either of the 2 pieces of your kit. It's not entirely impossible. I mean, you can spend some of your rage on Revenge at times, when your health is a little lower, and then when your health is a little fuller, you can execute. But it creates sort of an irritating friction, in my mind at least. Now let's talk about talents, and I have 2 main talent setups to consider here. Mythic Plus one or all dungeons. You know, you can use it in Heroic and Mythic 0 dungeons as well, and a raid setup. Alright, I have pulled up the Protection Warrior Mythic Plus talents here. I have a couple of talent setups I want to show off, a Mythic Plus one and a raid one. Technically, there's sort of two raid ones, a single target and an AoE, but the raid AoE one and the Mythic Plus one are very, very close. So starting here with the Mythic Plus one, if you want to just sort of compare like what this would look like as a leveling talent setup, I think it pretty much looks like this. You want to pick up Wild Strikes, the Thunderous Roar, and so on over in this tree pretty much straight away while you're leveling. Thunderous Roar is great. You can also go over towards Shockwave and take Sonic Boom and Rumbling Earth, and then you just sort of have a couple of points to toss around wherever. Like, that is also an option. I do really like this setup. You can also do sort of a setup that has a little of both. You can have Shockwave just as like a regular old CC tool, and it is a nice little rage generator now, and then have Thunderous Roar as well as a damage cooldown. You do lose out on that cooldown reduction from Uproar if you go this route, but it gives you a little bit more CC in Mythic Plus, which is never a bad thing to have. One talent that I pick up in a lot of these trees that I just want to be clear is actually kind of bad is Sidearm. I really only pick it up because sometimes you want to come down here and pick up Barbaric Training just to get a little bit more damage value out of your Revenge casts. And your options are Overwhelming Rage, which is actually pretty great utility-wise, but it costs 2 points, so it's just too expensive with how much of the stuff up in the top half of the tree is really good. In some of the raid setups, Stormbolt's going to have no value, so Sidearm, which doesn't add a lot, is still going to be better than literally nothing, but for Mythic Plus, Stormbolt is very good. Impending Victory is really good. It's basically just like a free self-heal, like a health stone on a 25-second cooldown. Pretty hard to complain about that. I don't take Intervene or Berserker Rage in any of the baseline talent setups. They are good skills, they're iconic too, so it's kind of weird to not have them. You can give up some of these talents like Barbaric Training. You know, it's a potential damage increase, but it also makes you spend quite a bit more rage on your Revenge. That's something you can give up in the pursuit of either of these more iconic utility skills. But generally speaking, the, you know, Berserker Rage and Intervene, they're just not must-haves most of the time. What is a must-have most of the time is Avatar. You actually do have the option of Immovable Object or Unstoppable Force. For anything AoE related, so Mythic Plus and AoE raid fights, I'm taking Unstoppable Force 100% of the time. I think for a pure single target raid fight where you're really taking a crazy amount of damage, Immovable Object is an option. You do get a lot of cooldown reduction on Avatar and Shield Wall thanks to just your talent tree, you know, Anger Management over here, Impenetrable Wall here. So this becomes an option, and it weirdly makes Shield Wall into kind of an offensive cooldown because pressing it will give you some Avatar uptime. It's a little weird, but it does add a huge amount of defensive cooldown uptime, so that is good. Now let's take a look at the right tree. You have some talents that are pretty much locked in. You know, you have Rend, which is this massive damage bleed, and it is automatically applied by taking Blood and Thunder over in the left tree, so those two talents are both kind of locked in, and then they have this beautiful synergy with each other. Most of these talents, Demoralizing Shout, Devastator, Last Stand, Shield Wall, all this stuff down here in the bottom center of the tree, Booming Voice, Indomitable, Violent Outburst, these are all must-haves. Some of the optional talents are things like Blood Surge, which basically gives you about half a rage per second per target that you're fighting, you know, assuming you're able to keep all of your bleeds up on everything you're fighting, which is very easy to do. As long as you're hitting Thunderclap and Revenge, occasionally you're going to have bleeds on every enemy you're fighting. So in single target, half a rage a second is pretty bad. That's about the absolute floor for rage generation for any talents. Like War Machine over here, your auto attacks generate 50% more rage. This is about the worst rage generation talent you can get in any of the trees, and that's exactly how much it gives, about 1 rage every 2 seconds. So Blood Surge is right at that level in single target, so you wouldn't want to take it in single target, but for AoE, you know, if you're tanking 5 targets, that's 2.5 rage a second. That's great. Just to point out some choice nodes, Enduring Defenses is one of the strongest defensive nodes in the entire tree. It just gives you so much shield block uptime, and it is the main reason that you're able to have 100% shield block uptime on a prot warrior now. Because of that, because of taking enduring defenses, you are able to take into the fray in Mythic Plus, and you can get away with running into the fray and still have shield block at, max uptime without any issue. Having shield charge and champion's bulwark gives you this really powerful offensive cooldown that also generates rage and gives you the ability to cast a free revenge and gives you a full 8-second shield block when you cast it. It's just a really powerful skill. Oh, it also does a 4-second stun. I mean, it's just great. It does like a huge amount of damage too, so you do want to have your cooldowns up, your demoralizing shout up on the enemy, avatar up when you cast shield charge. And the same goes for Ravager. The talents supporting Ravager are pretty bad. Dance of Death is like pretty low value. Storm of Steel also relatively low value. It makes it into a better rage generator, but it reduces the damage by so much that I actually think it makes it into a worse talent to have Storm of Steel. Very, very confusing talent design over here. But that's okay because you have so many good talents down in the bottom of the tree, and you have so many competitive options like Champion's Bulwark and Shield Charge. All of these three guys here. It's kind of okay to have some just garbage down here as well, like Battering Ram and Storm of Steel, that you can go, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to worry about not getting that. Battle-Scarred Veteran is an option. I think if I were to pick that up to have like a really powerful defensive cooldown layer, like a passive defensive cooldown layer, if I'm just really scared of dying, I would probably drop Ravager to get it. I don't really think that Battle-Scarred Veteran is all that great, though. I don't think it's worth giving up the active, defensive, and offensive value of Ravager pretty much in any situation, but it's not impossible that that could, be useful for some people. One other final note here, Tough as Nails just gives you this really nice reactive physical damage, but it ignores armor whenever you block attacks. And because you have shield block up 100% of the time, this is going to be triggering all the time. And it actually does deal quite a lot of damage now. It didn't early on in the beta. It was very bad, but they buffed it a lot, and it's pretty strong. It is in a choice node with spell block, which has no cost. It's just a 90-second cooldown, 20-second uptime, lets you block spells. And again, because you're blocking everything, if you're taking spells to the face that you're not able to spell reflect, this actually will massively reduce the damage that they deal. So spell block is a more defensive option. It can be useful in really high level Mythic Plus, but I think most of the time, Tough as Nails for that just reactive, passive, tons of damage is the way to go. Now let's take a look at the single target raid talent setup, just to compare. As you can see over here in the left tree, pretty similar setup. The only thing that I really moved around was I dropped Seismic Reverberation, which is an amazing talent. It makes your revenge hit for an extra 30% damage if you hit 3 or more enemies. In single target, you're never going to hit more than one enemy. You're fighting one person. So literally worthless there, extremely valuable anytime that you are going to hit 3 or more targets. Honestly, the worst part about this talent is just remembering to spec in and out of it based on the target count that you're fighting. I took Bitter Immunity with that point, but you could very easily shove it into Berserker Rage or Intervene or Second Wind or Inspiring Presence or really anywhere else in the tree that you would like. One place I wouldn't recommend is Honed Reflexes, and while it seems like it's a good talent, is 1 second off the cooldown of Shield Slam, this is like 1 second that is then reduced by haste. So if I were to spec into this talent, I wouldn't actually get like what is my base cooldown here? 7.6 seconds. It wouldn't go down to 6.6 seconds. It would go down to like 6.8 or maybe 6.9, depending on how much haste you have. So that gets munched up pretty hard. And then because of the way that, see where we are, Strategist, the way that all of the skills in your toolkit reset the cooldown of Shield Slam, you rarely have a Shield Slam actually run its full cooldown anyways. So Honed Reflexes winds up being a pretty low value talent. I mean, you can take it, you could drop Bitter Immunity and take it. I just don't think that you're really going to ever notice much value gained from it. Let's just point out some of the choice nodes that you drop over here. Like I said, you do drop Blood Surge because in single target, you're getting very low rage value out of it, and you're better off picking up some other things like Thunderlord, which gives you more demoralizing shout uptime, especially since you're going to be running Unstoppable Force and getting Thunderclap on a shorter cooldown fairly often. So even though you're in single target and Thunderlord doesn't seem like it adds that much cooldown reduction value, it's still going to shave like 10 seconds off the cooldown of Demoralizing Shout, which with Booming Voice generates rage and makes you deal more damage. So that's pretty good. You also want to drop Show of Force, which increases your Revenge and Thunderclap damage, and just pick up Sudden Death, which lets you use Executes for free. They do a lot more damage in single target, but in AoE, Show of Force is the better talent. One option, talent-wise, is to take Heavy Repercussions. Sometimes when you're single target tanking, you won't be standing with the rest of your group, and obviously you're only going to be standing near one enemy, so Into the Fray might actually not wind up being very useful, because you might only be getting 1 or 2 stacks at a time. If you are able to maintain the full 5 stacks, you're standing with your raid the whole time, then I would still take Into the Fray. Otherwise, Heavy Repercussions, it's good. It adds a lot of shield block uptime, which you don't really need, but it's, you know, it's sort of like I don't know, an extra seatbelt while you're already seatbelted in. It's better to have more defense and not need it than need defense and not have it. It also gives you some more rage generation, which isn't as good as 10% haste, but it's definitely better than like 2% haste, so there you are. Finally, you absolutely want to take up Impenetrable Wall. Impenetrable Wall is a great talent even in AoE, it's just ultimately you have to choose to lose something in AoE tanking, and I think Impenetrable Wall usually winds up being the kind of lowest value talent of the things that remain here in the middle of the tree. You don't have to take Tough as Nails in single target. You know, a lot of the time in single target, you'll be taunt swapping back and forth as well, so you're going to get pretty low value out of this. It's more than you're probably going to get out of like Bolster, but you could take that for a little bit more cooldown availability and even more shield block uptime, just in case you're struggling for any reason. Or you could take Spell Block if you feel like you're going to get blasted in the face with a bunch of spell damage. And then finally, let me show off the Raid AoE build, which is, like I said before, very similar to the Mythic Plus build. I think it's exactly identical over here in the right tree. And in the left tree, we've basically just dropped Stormbolt and taken Sidearm. Well, that's pretty much it. Now let's talk about Protection Warrior's abilities. Shield Slam is your main rotational skill, it's your main rage generator, and you have a ton of great talents that add extra value onto it. Thunderclap is your secondary rage generator and a great damage dealing spell in AoE. Revenge is your main offensive rage spender, Execute is better for single target damage obviously, but it only works when enemies are in Execute range, or when Sudden Death procs if you're talented into Sudden Death. When you have Avatar active, if you're talented into Unstoppable Force, which you usually are, your Thunderclap will hit super hard and should be your core skill in AoE. Basically, your rotation during Avatar will look something like Thunderclap, Shield Slam, Thunderclap Revenge, Thunderclap something else, Thunderclap some more, etc. Using your cooldowns is pretty simple. You want to use Avatar and Demoralizing Shout as much as you can. The same goes for Ravager and Shield Charge as well. As for Shield Wall, be liberal with it, the cooldown is pretty short. The same goes for Spell Reflection. Rallying Cry is great when your raid or dungeon group needs it for a specific mechanic, you know, to live through some sort of group-wide damage. Otherwise, you just kinda can try to use it whenever bosses are gonna deal big, unavoidable hits of damage to you. The same goes for Last Stand. Last Stand is a lot more useful as a reactive defensive cooldown than most of the rest of your kit. If your health drops low unexpectedly, you know, suddenly you go from full to 30%, hitting Last Stand could buy you a lot more breathing room to get your health back up. Let's go over your main defensive skills. You have Shield Block, which you want to maintain 100% of the time you're tanking. Your talent setup should make this pretty easy. If you're taunt swapping a boss back and forth in raids, you don't have to maintain Shield Block while you're not tanking. I mean, you're not tanking. You probably won't have to spec your talents into as many Shield Block uptime increases in that situation as well. If you're tanking Mythic Plus, or you're tanking a boss for the entirety of a raid fight, you will want to pick up at least a couple of talents to boost your shield block uptime, just to be sure you never let it fall off. The difference in damage taken between a blocked hit and an unblocked hit is massive. After that, you have Ignore Pain to absorb any damage that gets past your shield, and you can use Impending Victory as a quick self-heal whenever your health drops a bit low. I didn't write anything down here about mobility skills, but basically you have Charge and you have Heroic Leap. They're some of the simplest, but most powerful mobility skills in the game. They're really good, they're just pretty straightforward. If you need to move across the room, Heroic Leap's got you covered. You want to get to an enemy? Press Charge. That's it. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Protection Warrior. I like to start out by charging in and hitting Thunderclap. Pretty easy. You want to get shield block up immediately on a pull. I always try to hit Avatar while I'm mid-charge because it's off the global cooldown, and then use Thunderclap immediately afterward so that it's buffed by Avatar. Then I would use shield block, Demoralizing Shout to get that damage buff active, then shield charge, then more Thunderclap, and then all the rest of my offensive cooldowns. Probably would hit Revenge before it's no longer free, you know, but then all my offensive cooldowns like Ravager and Thunderous Roar or Shockwave, and then you pretty much have Threat all locked up. You want to use Shield Slam to generate Rage, but getting that AoE damage out at the start of the pull is more important than generating Rage with Shield Slam. You want to lock up Threat first. Then you can get into a more normal rotation. If you don't have Avatar up on the pull, you can still get in there with a basic Thunderclap and Revenge, and that should get Threat locked up for you. You generally will want to have Avatar and Demo Shout going when you cast Shield Charge and Ravager, as that is a pretty big damage increase to layer your offensive cooldowns onto each other, you know, like that. In terms of stats, Warriors wanted Enchant and Gem for haste, and then Versatility is your second best secondary stat. Technically, you could run Crit ahead of Versatility. It will actually give you more damage reduction overall, but it's quite a bit less consistent. I mean, it literally doesn't do anything against magic damage, but it will reduce more damage overall just simply by adding more parry chance. It'll also probably give you more damage output than Versatility, but it's fairly close. Haste really is more important. And more important than any of those is Strength. Whenever possible, you just want to maximize your item level. Then you can worry about secondary stats after you've focused on getting your item level up. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.